This is a box I built with what are called double-double box joints. And this is the device I used to make that box. It's a single blade, programmable, screw advance box joint jig. To make a box like that one, you'll need some way to make variable width box joint cuts with a high degree of precision. In this video, I'll focus on the cuts you need to make and the assembly steps. If you want to know more about the device I used, I've got a separate video about that, and I've put a link in the notes. This box I showed you earlier was made to be a pencil box, pencil holder for my desk. There's an insert for that plays no further role here. And let's take a look at these joints on it a little more closely for a moment. The two woods I've made this out of are quilted maple and Bubinga, and you always want two contrasting woods in this kind of a project. I'm going to call this a side, obviously, and I'm going to call these areas that are the same wood species as the side, I'm going to call these the fingers, and I'm going to call the contrasting wood parts a border. So here the fingers are Bubinga and the border is maple, and on the other side of the box it's the other way around. To make this joint, you need to decide on three measurements to plan it. First, there's the thickness of the sides, which in this case is a ½ inch, but it's going to be narrower in the build of the companion piece that I'm going to demonstrate. The second dimension that you need to decide is the width of these wide fingers. In this case, that's also a ½ inch, so the wide fingers are square, but they'll be rectangular in the companion piece that we're building. The third thing you have to decide is the thickness of this border. In this case, I used 3/32 of an inch. That's a purely aesthetic choice. A wider border is a bolder look, and a narrow one looks a little more refined. A wider border is also a little more forgiving if your blade height is just a smidgen off when you make the cuts. It may be worth pointing out the relationship between the wide fingers and the narrow ones. If you look at a narrow finger and the border around it, from the other side of the corner, you see that it's a wide finger there. So a narrow finger width plus 2 border widths is exactly the same as a wide finger width. That's why we didn't have to choose a width for the narrow fingers. That's determined by our choices for wide finger width and border thickness. The companion piece I'm going to build will be designed to hold a supply of 3x5 inch note cards that I use for grocery lists or various kinds of notes. Here's the general idea done with 1/4 inch MDF and simple box joints, just to get an idea of the dimensions. Because this is a smaller and slimmer box than the pencil holder, it seems to me that ½ inch thick sides would be out of proportion. These 1/4 inch sides look about right to me, but I think the double-double joints would look better if the sides were just a bit thicker, so I'm going with 5/16 of an inch. The first step is to cut the pieces we'll need and mill them to the desired thickness. For our purposes, it's not critical that the sides be exactly 5/16 or any other particular thickness, but it is very important that they all be the same thickness, as accurately as we can achieve. Milling small, thin stock can be difficult to do directly. What I did was to lay the pieces out on a piece of flat shelving like they are here, with all the grains running lengthwise, but stuck down with double-sided tape. Then I ran the whole thing through my planer. You don't want to use thick carpet tape, but something like spec tape or intertape that's only about 10 mils thick with the backing removed. I found that if I position everything at least a few inches from the ends of the piece of shelving, I have no problem with planer snipe. Because of the use I'll be making of this box, I know that internally it should be just over 3 inches wide. In the other dimension, I want it to hold a couple of packs of the index cards, so just over 1.5 inches in that dimension. So how wide should I cut the side pieces? If we were doing regular box joints, the side width would be the internal dimension plus 2 times the side thickness, plus maybe a 1/16 of an inch or so, so we could leave the joints just a little proud and then sand them or route them flush. For this kind of joinery, there are 2 things wrong with that. First, don't be thinking about extra to be sanded down later. We have to get these very nearly exact at assembly time. Second, the sides we cut are going to be widened by the borders. Looking at the pencil box again, the maple side piece goes from here to here. And then you have the two border thicknesses to get to the exterior dimension. So the width of the side pieces is the internal width plus 2 times the side thickness minus 2 times the border thickness. We need to cut 8 pieces. First, there are the 2 wide sides we'll do in Bubinga and the 2 narrower sides that we'll do in maple. These have the grain running horizontally. Then for each side piece, like this and this, we have a piece of the contrasting wood cut to the same height as the side piece, but with the grain running vertically. The width of these pieces doesn't have to be exact because they'll be trimmed later. They have to be at least 2 side thicknesses plus 2 border thicknesses plus enough extra to let us cut them in 2 after we've cut joints into both sides. Finally, there's one additional piece that doesn't have to be the same kind of wood that we're using for everything else, but it does have to be milled to the same thickness as everything else. I use this piece to help me get the blade height set. The blade height needs to be the same as the side thicknesses as accurately as we can make it. A 64th of an inch off is going to be more than enough to make the borders visibly inconsistent. I use the extra piece milled to the same thickness as the others to tweak the blade height until it just barely cuts through. Then tighten that down and we don't move the blade again until we're finished. This is what we're looking for. The blade height is set where all the little variations in the wood surface determine whether the cut goes all the way through or not. Here are the cuts in each Bubinga side piece. We have narrow fingers separated by wider spaces. A ½ inch is the fundamental width. After they are surrounded by the border, the fingers will be ½ an inch wide, and subtracting the width of the border leaves the remaining gaps ½ an inch wide. The finger widths are 1/2 minus 2 border widths, and the gaps are 1/2 plus 2 border widths. With the border width of 3/32, that means that the fingers are 5/16 of an inch wide and the gaps are 11/16. This will be the top of the box. The border will go on 2 sides of this top finger, but not along the top. This gives the cleanest look for the top of the box and gives us plenty of wood to work with if we want to round the edges. The cuts in the maple sides are similar, but the fingers are shifted down 13/32 of an inch from the top. This is the width of the Bubinga side's top finger plus 1 border thickness. To make the borders, we start by making cuts that mirror the cuts in the side piece. Obviously, I'm going to need to cut this piece in half at some point, but to avoid dealing with narrow pieces going through a table saw blade, I find it easier to glue one side, then cut, then glue the other side. You might wonder why the grain runs vertically in the border piece instead of horizontally like the side pieces. The answer is that this way, when we're done, we won't have any exposed end grain. The end grain is all buried inside the joints. I'm using this DAP Rapid Fuse CA glue. It's thicker than liquid super glues, but not as thick as the gel ones. It does grab and cure quickly, but you get about 30 seconds to move the piece, which I've found to be enough, at least so far. Here are the 4 sides after the border pieces have been glued onto one edge, cut in 2, and glued onto the other edge of each side piece. At this point, the border pieces are various widths. The only important thing is that we have at least 3/32 of wood past the end of each of these narrow fingers, and clearly we have much more than that. Now comes the part that may be the most nerve-wracking of the whole project. We need to trim each of the borders so that they have exactly 3/32 of wood beyond the end of each of the fingers. You can do this the old-fashioned way with lots of measuring and little taps on the fence. But if you have any fence micro-adjustment doodads, this is the time to bring them out. If you do this right, the borders at the tops, bottoms, and sides of each of the fingers will all be the same width. The good news is if you're a little bit off in trimming the tops, the bottoms will be off by the same amount in the same direction, so there will still be some symmetry. You might even want to do that deliberately for a different look. Or you might want to claim that you did it deliberately even though you didn't. Well, I got them trimmed without any disasters. The last step before final assembly is to cut 1/2-inch box joints in both edges of all 4 sides. We want these cuts to be right in the middle of the wide areas of border material. On the Bubinga side, that means we make our first 1/2-inch cut starting 13/32 of an inch down from the top. Cut 1/2 inch, skip 1/2 inch, cut 1/2 inch, skip 1/2 inch, and so on. On the maple side, that means we make our first cut starts right at the top, but is only 13/32 of an inch wide, and then we start skip a 1/2 inch, cut a 1/2 inch, skip a 1/2 inch, cut a 1/2 inch, and so on. And here are the pieces with the final cuts made. Assembly is straightforward. Like all box joints, these are largely self-aligning. You can apply your favorite techniques for making sure everything is square and for gluing and finishing. And here's the finished piece, standing beside its big brother. I used General Finish's Armor Seal satin for the finish on both pieces. That's about it. Thanks for watching, and happy joinery!